Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Today is Tuesday, July 28th, at least in this time zone. And welcome to the Kubernetes SIG Testing bi-weekly meeting. I am your host, Aaron Herkenberger. This is a Kubernetes community meeting, so we're all going to adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which means basically we're all going to be our very best selves and not be jerks. This meeting is being publicly recorded and will be posted to YouTube later. So today on the agenda, we have a proposal that Jordan and Ben and myself have been working on to suggest some policies to maybe improve the stability of Kubernetes CI in the short term, and we'll see where the conversation takes us from there. Jordan, did you want to speak to this, or do you want me to speak to it?
I can give the 1-minute blurb if you want.
Okay.
So CI issues are not new to Kubernetes. This has been an ongoing problem for years at this point. It is more or less of a problem at different points in time. We see it crop up a lot, usually around code freeze, when lots of things are trying to get in and there's lots of load and lots of people very concerned about how quickly their pull requests get merged. This release, it was particularly bad. There were 2 or 3 real issues that were causing lots of flakes, but they were lost in the noise of other test failures. And so it was hard to find them. It was hard to get the fixes that resolved them in. It was hard to get signal on release blocking jobs. And so there have been a lot of things said over the past few years about needing to do better and hold test owners and component owners accountable for their tests. It's very hard to do that when it can legitimately be said that a lot of the test failures are not the fault of the component owner or the test owner. And so this proposal is trying to put in place things that will improve the infrastructure aspect so that when we see a test failure, we can actually open issues for that component owner and test owner and say, your test is failing, and we have a reasonable degree of certainty that it's not an infrastructure problem. You need to fix your test or else. And the or else is to be determined, but we envision things like disabling jobs that are permanently failing, or not allowing SIGs to merge features if their test health is demonstrably bad. Like I said, to be determined, but the first step is getting to a point where we can actually reasonably rule out infrastructure issues and say the owner of this tester component is the one who needs to resolve this failure.
How about I unmute myself? So does anybody disagree with Jordan's statement of the problem or our stated goals?
Can I just, not to disagree with any of that, just kind of add some kind of overall control? It seems kind of bad that things got this bad, right? It seems like there should have been alarm bells ringing earlier and focus brought earlier, just kind of at a very high level, to figure out whether it's infrastructure or, discipline of the component owners or test owners or whatever.
I agree with that. It's why I'm happy there are so many people here, because I think we could use everybody's help in figuring out how to motivate everybody properly. How do we align our incentives such that people are inherently motivated to do the right thing, right? Like we should be encouraging people to brush their teeth every day. We shouldn't have to drag them to the dentist to get a root canal every year and a half or so. Um, so I can run through the specific policies we proposed here, see what the group thinks about these. I'm also open to suggestions from the group about what they think could be done as follow-on to these, but I feel like I'd at least like to understand if we can get sign off on some of these things. Does that seem fair to everybody?
Yes, this is necessary before making any actual more progress.
Yeah. So it seems like the biggest problem we're running into at the moment, for whatever reasons, are resource constraints. And because the majority of our jobs schedule themselves as best effort or possibly burstable pods, we have the scheduler can't make a very informed decision about how to place pods appropriately and whether it even has enough capacity in the cluster to place pods appropriately, such that tests are guaranteed the resources that they need. So I think like these are generally listed in sort of order of importance, I think. I think the most important thing is to get to a place where all release blocking and all merge blocking jobs actually declare the resources that they need, yeah, such that they can become guaranteed quality of service pods. So when when pods have non-zero resource requests for memory and CPU, and they have limits that match that, the scheduler is sort of guarantees that wherever it schedules that pod is guaranteed to get those resources. It's also going to be the highest priority pod that's left on a node as long as possible should there be any reason to evict pods off of the node. We feel like these are the most critical jobs. We feel like it's most important to declare these things. The state of things today, like I said, is some jobs declare some resource requests. A PR just landed yesterday afternoon to make a best guess at what the CPU and memory limits might be for release blocking jobs. So those would be the jobs that run on the SIG release master blocking dashboard. Those are the jobs that run periodically. Those jobs are going to end up consuming less resources than pre-submits, because pre-submits end up having to rebuild Kubernetes from scratch every time before they start spinning up a cluster and launching E2E tests, whereas the release blocking jobs just download a pre-built version of Kubernetes. So my proposal is we do this for the release blocking jobs now and see how this works out for those. And assuming we don't see anything bumpy, we then move to do this for pre-submits. We would enforce this and all of the policies we're suggesting here via tests that would run against job configs submitted to the test info repo. So you wouldn't be able to land a job config and have it be on a release blocking dashboard unless it actually had the appropriate resource requests and limits. Our suspicion, well, let me stop there. Does that sound reasonable to everybody?
So all of it sounds reasonable. What I would like to mention is that the main blocker for setting proper requests and limits in the past in PowerCase.io has been that there's zero public data around what jobs actually use. So I think the first step here would be to start collecting this data.
I agree completely. I will show you just real briefly how I took the guesses on the release blocking pods. So this cluster is a GK cluster. It's stood up in Google Cloud, and with that, we get Google Cloud monitoring and logging. Based on the metrics that I got out of the box with cloud monitoring, I'm not saying I liked this. This was still very manual, but I tried to see if I could gather metrics that showed like what a given job was using in terms of CPU or memory usage over time. Let's see if this still actually works.
Aaron, before diving too deeply into the data that you have access to, I think maybe you should mention the...
Right. So I just wanted to show this and then say that I'm using this with an account that hasn't even activated its free trial of Google Cloud. And the reason I'm getting away with this is because I'm a member of a group called K10 for Proud Viewers, which will give you read-only access to all of the things that are necessary for running Prow over in the WGK infra land. So I can't offer this capability for the Prow build cluster that runs in google.com, but we can happily provide this to anybody who wants to work with the publicly funded and available Prow build clusters. This is the cluster I've been moving. This is why I've been trying to move all the release blocking jobs over to that cluster. That's the one the community owns. So if you want to see what I'm seeing, I'm open to anybody PRing themselves into this group so that they can see this lovely graph, which shows that the kind IPv6 job is using roughly whatever, like 14 gigs of RAM at its peak, at least as far as these metrics think. I don't know if these are true. I don't know how to trust them, and I'm super open to suggestions on other ways to collect this kind of data, but that's the best answer I have to Alvaro's concern.
So could I ask you, Aaron, how would people request that access that you're talking about there?
They open a PR against this file.
Okay. I think Jorge's adding that in. Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, I just wanted to capture for the notes and Jorge's put that in. Thanks, Jorge.
Daniel's already done that. I can find his PR to link to give you an example.
Yeah. And we have it on the notes now, which is why I asked. That's brilliant. Thank you.
So like I said, this is only available for the Kubernetes IO cluster, which only runs periodics and release blocking jobs. You get no visibility into what's going on with pre-submits. It's why I think we should be incentivized to try moving the rest of the release blocking jobs over to that cluster, and also moving the merge blocking pre-submits over to that cluster or another cluster dedicated to it. This is number one, so we can ensure that our critical jobs are running in a cluster where like everything is now well behaved. Like everything that runs in that cluster has to declare its resources up front, so the scheduler can make a much better informed decision about where it should be placing its pods. These jobs aren't going to land on a node where suddenly memory usage or CPU usage is going to explode. I'm open to suggestion from folks whether they think this should be dedicated, we should have like a dedicated cluster for periodics and then another one for merge blocking. I'll caveat all of this that, again, all of this infrastructure is in a place where the community is able to run this. And so I would really like to see other people involved in spinning up these clusters using the code and infrastructure that's publicly available there. I'm not sure we'd be helping anybody here if just the few select overloaded Googlers continue to run the few select clusters. So I'm not saying that has to, like, we can help for expediency, but I really think this should be the start of a broader community ownership of these resources. Ideally, at the end of all that, we should have a cluster that is appropriately scaled and sized for all of the release blocking jobs. In the event that that doesn't seem to be enough, or as we continue to move things over, we think that we should also start to enforce some better accountability and hygiene on all of the other jobs for all of the other repos, or all of the other jobs for Kubernetes that are not required merge blocking jobs, or they're periodics that just happen to be informative. We think every job should have contact info associated with it. This is something I mandated a while ago for the release blocking jobs, so that everybody would get emailed when their jobs broke. And then in the interesting case of jobs that run like a bunch of tests owned by a bunch of different SIGs. The release team has sort of handled that with the CI signal team. The CI signal folks are sort of responsible for figuring out where to triage or route that as appropriate. There's part of me that wishes that less toil was involved with that, but I think that's also been a relatively effective model for those catch-all jobs. For jobs that are not catch-alls and are owned by a specific SIG, use that SIG's, I don't know, group as the email address, or maybe they have a dedicated group for alerts. But the idea is that ultimately, if you're going to use community resources like Prow, you should have a point of contact. And then so we know that alerts are being sent to you, the point of contact is being alerted that the job is continuously failing. If the job still never gets back to a good state, then we should probably just go ahead and disable those jobs so we free up resources and stop paying for resources we're not using and stop crowding out jobs that could legitimately use those resources for legitimate signal. Just to give you a taste of what the state of things are like, this used to be visible on the Grafana dashboard, but we do have a query that runs every day, and you can see, for example, CI Kubernetes node kubelet serial job has been failing continuously for 934 days in a row. And there are not to single out node, there are a bunch of jobs owned by a bunch of different SIGs that do a bunch of different things that have been continuously failing. I feel like jobs that have been failing for hundreds and hundreds of days are probably good candidates to look at disabling first. I can't give you a great assessment of what sort of resources this would free up, however, but we think this might help. That concludes all of the proposed policies here. Questions, comments, concerns, suggestions?
I think we're all just in shocked silence at jobs failing for years and years.
Basically, every SIG testing presentation I have ever given at KubeCon takes a moment to pause on the jobs that have been continuously failing. And it started out at like 100 days, and then eventually I thought, well, maybe we'll get it to like, we'll clear it out after a year or 2 years.
I think the time is now. But we all agree this is not a reasonable thing. The time is now.
Yep. So I'll stop reading to everybody. I think I was, personally, I'm more interested in this being a bit of a dialogue. I'm sure there are lots of people here who have opinions or suggestions on what we could do next. So I'm interested in hearing first if everything that's proposed here seems like a good, reasonable first step. Second, who wants to help? Third, when Jordan mailed out this proposal, he talked about the idea of like, maybe we should just not open, like we shouldn't open up the main branch of development back up for like anything goes. Like maybe we should, our focus after 119 should be continuing to address this test and CI signal pane until we feel like it's actually been properly addressed, as opposed to having a great angst for like a week or two and then everybody kind of moving on and spamming retests. I've spent entirely too long talking and need to take a break. Let's open it up for discussion.
Hi, Aaron. I have a quick question about the all the failed tests you just showed us, like the tests that have been failing for several years, maybe. So are those the ones that are triggered when a PR is submitted? No, they're not the ones.
Some are, some aren't. So the naming convention that we stuck to was if the job has CI in front of it, it's most likely a periodic And if the job name has PR or poll in front of it, then it's a pre-submit. And so the majority of these look like CI jobs, but there are also some failing pull request jobs.
Okay, thanks. So where are these CI jobs defined? Are they in test infra or they under the Kubernetes repo?
Yes, they're defined in this test infra repo. All of the jobs for all of the 150 plus repos across the 6 different Kubernetes orgs live in the test infra repo.
Okay. Okay, so based on my understanding, I think my suggestion here is that we should make a list of the long failing tests, and maybe volunteers can get work on some of them and can see there could be batches, and we can see how much resource we can free up by fixing the most frequently failing ones.
I like that idea. However, like I would love to get a little more confidence about like what actually is the resource usage here, and what would we free up by doing this. There's also a part of me that almost wants to default to like, if it's been failing this long and nobody's noticed, is it really that worth bringing back from the dead? Like it may very well be worth a sanity check. I know SIG Node has been doing a lot of inspection of their tests and kind of rediscovering some ancient tribal history, which has been really valuable for everybody. So it might be worth a little bit of a look, but I'm not sure that, like, perhaps we don't actually need all these jobs to begin with.
Yeah, I think as a matter of policy, perpetually failing jobs should not be allowed. And so regardless of how much resource they free up, if it hasn't passed successfully in weeks or months, that doesn't seem like something we should allow.
The other thing is that this has been periodically brought up that we have jobs failing this long, and yet we have ones that have now reached something like 3 years. I think the other thing to remember is that even if we delete a job, that's not by any means permanent. Everything's recorded in Git. If someone comes back later and thinks that this was valuable, they can put in the effort to bring it back. But just as a matter of policy, we shouldn't leave things failing for this long and just running and wasting resources, any amount.
So question, link to the list that was shown. The link is in the proposal document, which you can get to from the SIG testing meeting notes. It also lives in the testing for repo under a directory called metrics. I think, like, to G's point, like, I don't know, anytime the continuously failing jobs thing has been brought up, nobody has thought to make a giant umbrella issue with a huge checklist and a clearly defined set of work items such that people go off and do it. We have noticed that that does actually work for at least simple mechanical things like GoLint and shell check failures and stuff. But I feel like, A, this work is less mechanical, and B, this isn't about one-time fixes. This would be more about like SIGs kind of taking a look at the collective amount of time that they spend fixing their tests and their jobs today, and deciding if, with the budget that they have, do they want to take on more tests, or do they feel like they're already spending too much time fixing the tests that they currently own?
This is also the reason that the permanently failing job item was after the contact info item. I suspect that a fair number of these jobs are failing because nobody knows that they're running. And so the goal is not to disable jobs that are actually providing useful signal. It's to disable jobs that are not providing useful signal that nobody is really looking at or paying attention to.
I want to point out very quickly that we've talked a lot about resources and we've talked a lot about failing tests, and those are not always necessarily related. And that while this will all be super useful getting things to a healthy state will require another series of steps after this. Once we have more confidence in the CI, we're going to have to look at the tests. There are cases where we totally fail to run the tests or something like that. There's also a lot of flaky tests that are just the tests are flaky, or some piece of Kubernetes isn't quite reliable enough or something. And that probably will need its own proposal. Right now, it's a little difficult to look at, though, because CI is such a mess.
Yeah, I have a long list of follow-up ideas around particular tests or particular ways we could analyze the end-to-end and integration and verify test runs and identify particular problems for SIGs to go fix. And so my goal is to get good enough signal at the CI infrastructure level so that we can run some of these reports and then fan out to the SIG owners to say, hey, look, your end-to-end tests are consuming 40% of the end-to-end run. Please reduce that to this much, either by moving things to post-submit or by speeding up tests or whatever. Similarly for integration, here's a package that takes 10 minutes to run. Can you reduce that or parallelize things or collapse your coverage? But yeah, at that point, I think we can fan out and lean on the community, like the SIG owners, to drive that work.
So Jordan, how would people be able to action such decisions? Like, I mean, how would they be able to see, or how would you propose that that people are able to view reports indicating resource usage? Is that something that's there already, or something that would have to be built?
I mean, it depends. So for simple things like test runtime, you can go look in test grid and show a graph of how long every test took.
Sure, yeah.
And so you can see, like, this test takes 8 minutes on a typical run. Like, that seems excessive for a pre-submit. There are other tests where you can look at the graph and see, like, usually it takes, half a minute, but sometimes it takes 10 minutes. That seems like something that component owner should dig into and try to understand, like, is there a bug here? Is there, like, what's going on? So that view is really useful. It will become more useful once we run tests with consistent amounts of resources. So that will take some of the variance that is due to sort of noisy neighbors or environmental issues out of the picture and give us more confidence that the variance is actually due to the test.
Yeah, so most of the things we run have this data available already, but it's also noisier due to things like iffy infrastructure.
The other fun thing about the test grid, it just does this by default. I guess, I don't know if this is a feature or bug, but it sorts by the longest duration. So I can tell you right now that basic stateful set functionality should perform rolling updates, blah, 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 is the longest test that's currently in the default E2E suite. And it's hovering around 6 minutes, which is, that's actually a little bit over what we set our slow test threshold was. I don't know how long ago, and I'm sorry, I don't entirely know where it's documented. I think there's a document that describes the test tags and says that slow is reserved for tests that take 5 minutes or longer. So, it could look like a human kind of looks through this and is like, well, you know what, that's above 5 minutes, that's above 5 minutes, that's above 5 minutes. I'm going to go open up a PR and add the slow tag to these jobs. But who do I know to notify? Well, hopefully I know which SIG to notify because that's in the test name. And hopefully that SIG has some group of people who are responsive to pull requests related to tests triage, whether that be correctly identifying tests as slow or flaky, or fixing test failures. This is something I went through sort of last December, I think. We kicked out a number of really, really slow tests, and properly tag them as slow. But it would be wonderful to live in a world where we could have a machine do this sort of checking.
Yeah, I'll drop a link in the meeting notes to a doc that just had random ideas. I agree on wanting to automate this. Like, I think as an initial effort, if people are wanting to help, like identifying the top 10 or the top 20 or whatever issues and kind of getting those knocked out manually is great. But something where we actually can run a report and say, all right, for these omnibus jobs, what percentage of this job is being consumed by each SIG, and what do we think is reasonable? How long of a test do we want to allow in a pre-submit? How long of a test do we want to allow per package for integration? Things like that, and just say, what are our goals? If we want pre-submits to be able to finish in 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 30 minutes, 20 minutes, maybe, what do we have to do to get there? And then having tools that we run against the test results that say which SIGs are out of bounds for where we want to be, and publishing those metrics just like we publish the latest flakes and the latest failures. Say, and making that a part of the SIGs sort of week-to-week processes. Like, how are our tests? Are our tests flaky? Let's fix them. Are our tests consuming more time? Let's make them faster or move some of them to post-submits. So I think for SIG testing, what we can do here is sort of figure out how to get that data out of the current runs and the current test grids and get it in a form that's consumable for SIGs to show really clearly, like, these are the SIGs that are doing good, these are the SIGs that are not doing good. And then that can be input both for those SIGs to prioritize their work, but also for enforcement. SIGs that are not doing good, what should the consequence be? If your tests are unhealthy and you're eating more than your fair share of the community's time, should you prioritize that over features? I would expect probably so.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really good point, because there's been a lot of times where we've even, manually identified some of these things. Like SIGNode was a great example, and as has been pointed out, they're making a strong effort right now, but for quite some time there wasn't a lot of effort around that, and they were notified kind of like repeatedly, but there was no consequence for not doing it, right? So if there's a stated kind of like, you need to get this done by this time, and it's not to make their lives harder, it's just because it's fair to the community, and also they should probably know what they're testing and that sort of thing. So I think for any SIGs, just having kind of like this defined threshold for different areas of quality makes it a lot easier to encourage them to do things, and also makes it clear to them kind of like what they're actually striving towards, right? Instead of just going to them with a you need to make your tests better, we're seeing too many failures, right? We have tangible things that you need to meet, and like, please do that in a reasonable amount of time.
What's the stick?
Yeah, for the node example, like, you know what? We're just going to ship Kubernetes without testing that kubelet works. Doesn't.
No, I think it looks like features get held up. That's probably, I mean, and that's not really like a SIG testing specific call. That's going to be like testing and release and architecture, maybe. I don't know. But like right now, there are preconditions to adding things for API changes. Like, you have to have a proposal, you have to have, it has to be accepted, it has to have a migration plan and things like that. I think it is reasonable to say if a component is unhealthy based on the test reporting, it's not appropriate to be adding new things and making changes to that component. If we aren't certain that the current function is working properly, then we shouldn't be slamming more things into that area. We should be building confidence that the current level of function is working. So that the goal is not to be punitive, to like actually release high quality things.
Sure. I just want to hint at, it seems like that probably needs its own thought and discussion. I'm super on board with that. I also I try to add a carrot. Like, hey, SIGFU has the like most tested, best, super non-flaky components. Congrats.
Yeah.
So would it be on release to watch the signal and measure it against enhancement proposals for the KEPs that are tracked? Would that capture enough versus non-KEP content?
I'm not sure, Tim. We'd have to think through how the mechanics of it would work. I'm not sure.
Yeah, frankly speaking, I'm not sure either. I feel like KEP is that, like KEPs and production readiness reviews are really great injections of human thought into the process. But I also feel like it's possible for a component to decay at a faster cadence than that within a release cycle. So how can we appropriately, I don't, it's the usual question of like, well, how do we decide to revert an enhancement or whatever that turns out won't land in time? In this case, it's how do we tell a group of people like, stop attempting to land this, go off and fix this.
Yeah, I think the first thing we have to do is just get visibility. Like what are the standards? And if SIGs aren't meeting those standards, get visibility to that. I remember in some releases we've had CI signal reports, kind of the last month of the release that says, here's the top 3 flakes and what SIGs own them and whether progress has been made. And that was like an email that went out to the community once a week. And so like on the one hand, it adds visibility. Like maybe no one knew that it was going on. On the other hand, it adds a little bit of kind of, you don't want to be on the bad SIG list. I'm okay with that. Even if we don't have a super clear, like ironclad, things with this label will not merge and there's a bot enforcing it. Like even if we don't have that story yet, just saying like, here's how we've sliced up the resources we have, and here's how SIGs are consuming those. And I think that would do a lot to move the needle. Like if there's an email going out to the community once a week saying, these SIGs are out of SLO for these things, I think that would help.
So one thing I feel like we didn't quite get yet was, I guess maybe nobody had anything to say, but are there any objections to the things that are actually in scope for the current proposal, as opposed to continuing to think about what we'll do next after that? Anyone?
Explicit, I like the proposal. Thank you.
So the anti-pattern that I want to avoid here is when we talk about we doing stuff, I'm not talking exclusively about the 3 people who wrote the proposal, nor am I talking about the select few people who have access to google.com and its Proud Build cluster. I'm talking about we as a community need to work on this. So I feel like at a bare minimum, I took a best guess for the release master blocking stuff. And I feel like perhaps I did you all a disservice by doing that. I probably did more than my fair share of taking a look at jobs and assessing what was reasonable. And so I feel like it should be on folks here to decide what limits and such they want to set for their pre-submits. And we should go through that together as a community. That would be one suggestion. Another question I haven't heard raised by anybody here necessarily is like, what is the definition of success? We proposed a couple of things that we're planning on doing. but it's unclear to me. We've decided like what metric or means of measurement we're going to use to describe how awful things are now and how much better they are as a result of what we've done.
Yeah, can we have a measure of flakiness, the quantitative metric?
We have some, and we have people working on better ones, but I don't know if we have one that senses like everything.
I can speak to that with a little more screen share if you're interested. So I'm going to browse over to the Kubernetes testing for repo. Eventually. And I'm going to click on the metrics directory. And so what this is most of the test results that land in buckets that are visible by testgrid.k8s.io also end up getting scraped into a publicly accessible BigQuery database that anybody is capable of querying. We have a couple proud jobs that run queries against this database that look something like this. That's how I got the continuously failing number of PRs. So there's another one called Job Flakes. The config for it looks something like this. It took me about an hour and a half or 2 hours to really pick this apart. And it's like not perfect, but it does show the flakiest jobs for a given week. And it tries to call out the flakiest tests. And so here I could see that PR pull Kubernetes E2E GCE has a consistency of 84. So 84% of the time it'll run appropriately. So that means 16% of the time it's going to flake. And so
yeah, I've looked at this,
Yeah.
you know, particularly during the past few weeks when things were really bad, and these numbers were like 80 something, and you know we had jobs that were failing 50%, 90% of the time. It seemed like it to me.
Right. So there's some like imperfections in this process. So for example, data doesn't actually make it into this pipeline unless a job has actually finished. So for all of those jobs that were failing to schedule because of pod pending timeout, which we think is resource concerns, like none of that data makes its way here. This only really becomes more useful if we get to the point where jobs are actually scheduling. But then in theory, we could do the math of like taking a look at the consistency for each of the jobs and sort of multiplying it together and seeing, given all of the release blocking merge blocking jobs that we currently have for pre-submit, what's the percentage chance of you actually landing your PR in an ideal world where every test would pass to begin with? And like maybe that could possibly be a metric.
I have a really simple one I'd like to see. I'd like to see for the Kubernetes pre-submit blocking and release blocking jobs, because that's an easy set to say like those, as opposed to I'm not sure what all is in CI. I would like to stop seeing pod error state in the CI, as in the CI failed to run. Like it didn't schedule, it didn't finish the init containers, that sort of thing. There's still the tests themselves need to be healthy, and that we may continue to see regardless of this work, and that will be the next step. But we can look at the data that is served in Prow's website when you look at a job, prow.k8s.io, and there is a state that gets recorded when we like fail to schedule a pod, or when the pod just like errors, or it times out during pending. Those things reflect infrastructure problems, resource contention, inability to schedule. That's happening pretty frequently right now, and that's some of those failures you're seeing that don't show up in that flakiness metric. Conversely, we're not going to improve the flakiness of individual test cases most likely by changing the things in this proposal. We're going to get to a point where we're prepared to say, okay, flakiness is a problem with the test or the code, and then we work on that. So those grades.
Yeah, I agree. There are different sources of problems here. I was kind of moving back to the main point, which is adding all of them up. We need to be concerned, but even more importantly, breaking them down so they can be diagnosed and fixed.
Right, and so we have some tools for that. As Aaron mentioned, it doesn't catch this, and that's sort of the next step to this. The thing I want to see is those gray triangles. So the circles are, I think we stopped running it because there's like a new version of the code to test, and we're moving on. But whenever you see one of those alert triangles in gray, that's one of the entries where it's just we didn't manage to run it successfully one way or another at an infrastructure level. And though that data, that's a JSON endpoint. So if someone wants to scrape it and look at it, we have that. I want to see us get to a point where we stop having that for the set of critical jobs. I'm not certain that it's reasonable and for even the group here to solve that for everything in a short time frame. Which is part of the proposal to move those critical things to dedicated community managed clusters where we can capacity plan for those things.
That makes sense to me.
I think that's a pretty good success state for this proposal. It's not a success state for the project or for the healthiness of tests. That's another thing we need to work on, and what we spent sort of the second half of the meeting talking about, I think.
Yeah, so that was why I copied the SIG leads list into the thread, because there is going to be work for every SIG to go do in adding contact info to their jobs and turning down or fixing perpetually failing jobs, and then diving into particular tests that are flaking and dealing with those. So getting the leaders of those areas involved now to know this is coming. And I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise. Everybody knows, everyone who's tried to merge anything into Kubernetes in the last month and a half knows that we have a problem. And so clarifying who owns which parts of that problem is what we need to do.
Just a question I have, is it possible to leverage owners' files in order to attach ownership and responsibility to tests?
Sometimes an entire package is owned by a SIG. For unit tests, that's more likely to be true. And actually for E2E tests, that was done as well. Most of the E2E tests live in a package that is SIG specific. Integration tests are sort of all over the map. So that was one of the items in my follow-up suggestions. Like, we need strong association of tests with SIGs, individual tests, not a whole job.
E2E tests also usually have a SIG tag in them that allows the SIG to have like a test grid dashboard that filters to just their tests out of a run. And that also means that, okay, we're saying the SIG owns this.
To have somewhat of a mechanism for this called testowners.csv inside of the Kubernetes repo. But the original person who wrote it sort of moved on from the project, and nobody bothered to go figure out how that was generated. And so support for it's been removed from triage and other things. It could be worth investigating something like that. Because like E2E tests, we as humans can clearly sort of look at the SIG, whatever prefix of test name, but things like individual integration tests, we might need other kind of sort of manual parsing of that info. And I think
as a
machine consumer.
Sorry to cut across you there. Just as a background task on, I've been kind of dawdling on it, on working on bubbling up an error for where a label was configured via owners files. And as part of that work, I've been doing some front end work to make it easy to look at those files and so when I have that finished, skinning up, say, the flakiness JSON that you have there coming out of your queries and making that presentable and reportable, that's something that I could do.
That sounds great. So I don't know. I'm assuming the long silent gaps here are people generally agreeing this is a good idea, but yeah, I don't know. I just want to stress that saying that this is what we should do doesn't mean that it's going to happen. It's going to take folks actually stepping up to the plate and doing the work. And I really do appreciate everybody's ideas, opinions, and input, no matter how silly it might seem. Some of us have been really close to this and might not be able to think outside the box. And so I think suggestions on what we could all do going forward are really appreciated as well. Anybody else have anything they want to say on this topic, or shall we call this basically agreement that we should move forward with this and look to see some action required emails coming out soon?
Are there some things that are just kind of obvious enough that rather than starting with the email and action required, we could just start PRing them?
We did, but it wound up being all Aaron, which is something we want to avoid.
Well, so I'm sort of trying out the pod QoS guarantee thing for the release blocking jobs and seeing if they sort of flake any less randomly. I think it would be cool to see what or how the CI signal team currently takes an assessment of like how flaky things generally are. And if we could sort of see like, did that substantively improve things? If you wanted, you could go ahead and start PRing in resource requests and limits for pre-submits as well. And we could just all find out together what happens. Like we're theorizing in the doc that, you know, once we start guaranteeing resources for enough jobs, we suspect that some of the other 1,500 jobs or some of the other repos will not get scheduled for random reasons or might be kicked off of a pod for random reasons.
I was thinking like, okay, if I just pull a number out, say 400, look at the things that have been failing for 400 plus days, a number of things stand out to me. Like, hey, we're doing scalability testing against Kubernetes 1.13, except it's been failing for over 400 days.
That's probably mislabeled. Like for example, there's a Google dashboard that I have on my agenda to remove that has things that are running against the like stable one tags or whatever.
We're looking at some Amazon ones, and they're extracting CI latest 1.13.
That is also something that should probably be removed from CI entirely for other reasons. We have some CI that got added at some point that's using the upstream tests and nothing else upstream. I was pretty against that, and now that it's not being maintained, I think we have a clear path to just remove it.
Yeah, I like the idea of some of the cloud providers federating out and providing things back in, but if it's not happening, yeah. Oh, and to be fair, a whole set of them are from my employer also, VMware, so I don't want to sound like anti-Amazon there.
And be clear that there's this Google dashboard in Tesker that has a bunch of nonsense in it, but I took a look and most of what's in there turns out to just be like the dashboard isn't very good. The things that are running are actually not running because of that dashboard. They're just included in that dashboard as well.
With the, I guess one final question I have. So let's say we get to the point where that email gets sent out. It's like, put contact info on your jobs or else. What do you all feel is like a reasonable cadence and time frame for that? Like if we're in the magical world where we've got all the resource limits set and I send the email out today, okay, you have 1 week to go decide which jobs you own. And any job that doesn't have pull requests against it will just get deleted from the repo. We'll have it.
This is just contacts?
Yeah, just contacts.
A month? That leaves some leeway for like, oh, a bunch of people were out or something.
Can we just jail them for a while and before deletion?
Yeah, I think like scheduling them down to nothing is doable.
So what's the email that you want to send out, Aaron?
So I'm proposing if everybody, it sounds like everybody here is in agreement with all of the policies, we're proposing that once we get down to implementing the policy of contact info is required on all jobs. And I'm proposing that by some deadline, if a job doesn't have contact info, nobody wants it, so we're going to get rid of it. So how long do we give people to claim their jobs?
I'd be inclined to say to suggest maybe 4 weeks, but maybe not the 4 weeks of August, maybe the 4 weeks of September.
I would like to see it sooner, but I was thinking maybe like in over the next 2 weeks, please get back to us or start doing this. Otherwise, over the next 2 weeks, others are going to start removing. Like, I feel like I shouldn't just go out and start removing other people's things. But given a lot of time, if they're not starting to move, maybe I could sort of help by initiating a PR.
I was just thinking in terms of KubeCon and August being a sort of a holiday month for a lot of places.
Seeing a month of 2 months, I think it's reasonable for us to remember that humans are involved. I just also sort of feel like some of the jobs that have been failing for hundreds of days maybe aren't likely to get contact info. So it's something we'll think at.
Sorry, to get people to put contact info for everything, I would give plenty of time. For this job has been failing for hundreds and hundreds of days. I would say we're deleting it. If you're interested in it, you can come undelete it. And we should just go ahead and move forward with deleting. And if someone's interested, it's really not a big deal to revert, like removing something from Git, just some YAML, no big deal. There's not going to be like code conflicts or anything like that. They're separate chunks of configuration. And we can just notify people that this is being done. And if they miss that because they're out, they can come back and add it later. It should not be a big deal if something that's been failing for 900 days is gone for a week and then someone actually wanted it back. But in terms of like action required things, I'd give people more time. These, I would say we already had action required. You shouldn't have left it failing this long.
Okay, well that puts us over time. I really appreciate everybody showing up. And again, all questions, comments, and concerns on how to improve this situation are welcomed. This is only going to work if we all put in the work. So with that, say happy Tuesday, everybody. Thank you.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Howard. I'm from ARM.
Howard, can we get to your agenda item in 2 weeks? Sorry, it wasn't like scheduled ahead of time. So if you can ping Ben and I offline on Slack, if maybe we can chat about it in the SIG testing channel.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.